folks, today I'm going to show you how I paint this hammer guy, Parson, for my Tiri crew in Malifaux. Now, we used some lessons learned from the last time where we painted his buddy, the Owl Warrior, and I also used him as an opportunity to improve on stuff like the leather. So, grab your favorite hobby cat, and let's get this party started. Alright, real quick, what's the plan? Well, we're gonna match the other crew members, so turquoise skin, non-metallic metal, and a yellow base. Sorry folks, I'm getting excited. That leaves only one small choice, the chef's apron. I'm pretty sure this guy's a chef. I figure it works best as a brown leather, and with our color choices done, let's get a move on with, well, I guess the leather. Blank. I'm gonna start with the same recipe we used before for leather with a base coat of Malifaux's chocolate brown. And for some parts, I start an outline like when you color in blocks in a coloring book. I was really disappointed with how I did the leather before. Ew. So I wanted to tackle this model with my improvements immediately. As with any base coat, you want to take extra care with doing multiple, smooth, thin coats. And like I do here, you may decide to swap to bigger brushes for the bigger, flatter areas. Use this step as an opportunity for focused practice. Be really conscious and mindful of how you're performing and what you want to improve on. Not just better base coats, but maybe a slower approach, a better paint consistency, getting even coverage on the first pass, or perhaps not using actual chocolate this time if you ignored my previous warning. On my third or so layer, I actually changed directions of my brush strokes in some places, which helps with even coverage on large blocks or surfaces. And don't forget his turtleneck like I did. Malifaux gets cold sometimes, but not for your arms apparently. So one of the improvements I wanted to try from last time was give a better impression of texture, and with this model having a much larger portion of leather, it seemed like a great opportunity for stippling. So we'll take some Vallejo flat earth, get a short fat round brush for stabbing, and start pressing in some dots of this paint as our first highlight. Be sure to wipe off enough paint to start your experimentation with to see how much you like load it up before adding more. I like to start with wiping off almost as much as I would for dry brushing, but leave just a tad bit more paint on the brush. For darker colors, or colors like this one that's fairly close to the base coat's color, you could probably use a little more. This will absolutely destroy your brush bristles, so make sure you don't use a brush that you've grown attached to. Here I'm using an old makeup brush, and I'm not attached to this one at all because it owes me $5 and was rude to me when I confronted it about the whole thing. It was really awkward, and now I want to teach it a lesson. Stippling has a lot of cool uses in our miniature painting world and is a great way to introduce new textures into your paint job that may otherwise not be present. I like to use this stuff for rust or adding pockmarks to stone. Another good use for stippling is to slip it into conversations at art galleries where you're sure to impress the scarf-ridden crowd with your singular knowledge of a solitary technique. Just run away from the conversation immediately afterward for added mystery. Here I am establishing further dominance by stippling on an additional highlight of Vallejo Dark Sand. I'll use a bit more restraint when placing this highlight with stippling because, while it does a pretty cool effect, we don't want to just absolutely litter this model with dots of sand and lose that sweet texture of the flat earthwork. And we'll have more opportunities to add this color in a more controlled fashion where needed. I also choose to use a smaller, angled brush. I think it's called like a filbert brush or something, but its given name isn't important. What's important is that it has hopes and dreams, and also stiff bristles I don't give two craps about. I focus on highlighting areas of wear and tear, as well as simulating some highlights on areas like the shoulders. A simple trick to keep in mind for any humanoid figure is to emphasize brightness in the shoulders and the face, as it's where viewers will naturally draw their eyes. Unless they're different folk, in which case, it's gonna be his feet. Hey, I'm not kink-shaming anyone here. I'm just not gonna focus on his toesies for that niche population. Now I'm gonna go in with a brush to fill in some spots that could use some extra love and attention. Looking back, this felt absolutely unnecessary, but hey, it's too late. You already watched it. Sucker. Here we're going to unify all the colors together by taking our Vallejo Smoke base coat and adding in some Lamian medium to make a wash and just drown the entire thing. And I've got to say, hot damn, this looks good. Man, this is so sexy, I should start a YouTube channel. This should help with integrating the stippled highlights by bringing it closer to the base coat. Because we're washing the whole thing with this color, it puts the color's filter over the light colors like dark sand to make more sense with its gradation. And mid-tones like flat earth just end up looking like a natural highlight of chocolate. Plus, I heard that every time you do a heavy wash, an angel gets its wings, or finds its car keys. I can't remember the exact details. I think this is my new favorite application of brown for leather. I get super excited about stuff like this because I'm getting confirmation that I am in fact improving from the last time I tried this same thing, and I'm putting yet another tool in my Hello Kitty tool belt for the future. Make sure that you get excited for your paint successes, folks, because Scarlett Johansson's too busy to care for you, and it's important that you revel in your awesomeness, because you have oodles of it, my friend. I should know, I stalk you every other Wednesday. Next, we're going to further emphasize our shadows with some targeted glazing using GW's Nuln Oil. Now we're going to look for opportunities to create depth. Try to look for creases that the light wouldn't reach, especially creases that show the entire range from the highest dark sand highlight right next to the chocolate base coat. These are great places to enhance contrast. In other areas, you can use the glaze to filter large zones with no stippled highlights, and create some more interest and depth in a flat area. For this crew, I lean heavily on glazes, as you may have noticed the last time we painted the Owl Warrior. So it'll be pretty useful to take note of how I'm using the black wash to enhance the previous layers. We're going to be using this technique pretty heavily in upcoming steps for the skin and the metal bits like the Crab Smasher. The idea of a glaze is to have that transparent paint still show hints of the previous layer underneath to create smooth blending. This has a subtle difference over simply mixing the paint together for an additional layer, and I found that it's a better tool to have smooth blends over a small area, and has a pretty cool effect when you combine both glazing and mixing between the two colors. Try to keep it in mind that we're still going to add even further depth and highlights with the next steps, so don't get too hung up on getting this part perfect. Instead, try to have fun with experimenting with this technique, play around with going back to previously glazed areas and adding yet another smaller layer to see what happens. For the last quick steps, I throw on a few lines of black to emphasize some deep scratches, not too many because I'm a coward, and then I highlight those scratches with some dark sand. And that, my strange internet friend, is a much improved version of leather than last time. I can sleep happy knowing that I did at least one thing better this time. Now that the leather is done, we're going to move on to the skin, and for this we're going to need to go outside, touch some grass, and harvest a fresh bottle of Vallejo turquoise. After reveling in your ability to get in touch with Mother Nature, you're going to start working on a good, solid base coat using multiple thin layers. Remember the mantra I always say when it comes to this critical step, and say it with me, folks. Base coats are the foundation of your paint job, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. See, it just rolls off the tongue. Because this model has a significantly larger amount of skin than our previous paint job, I'm actually going to take even more care to make sure this is done smoothly. This guy basically has three main elements to his identity, which are his turquoise skin, the brown leather, and his metal crab smasher. So it's super important to make this hunk skin really stand out. Luckily, this turquoise does an excellent job of coverage even on the first pass, so I just focus on creating a good perimeter to make sure I don't go out of bounds and give a nice opaque coat. When I was first painting this guy, I got a bit confused because his card doesn't have any ranged attacks, but he certainly brought some guns to this fight. The dude definitely lifts. The great thing about this sculpt is the well-defined muscle. This is going to give us some awesome range with all the different values in his arms and face, of which this man certainly brought his grumpy game to the party. I did note while painting his head that he's got some very subtle textures with some wrinkles at the top of his head and the back of his neck, which will give us some opportunities to emphasize later on. And as a demonstration of commitment to my earlier statement, I'm not going to focus on his feet. See? That was quick. Now we'll take some of that Abteilung 502 Naples yellow and start a base coat for our desert base. Fun fact, I googled what Abteilung meant, and it actually translates to department, but be careful because in some circles, notably the violent crochet gangster crowd, it can be mistaken for an insult. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but I managed to find a way to paint so skillfully that the majority of this painting is not visible due to being blocked by the model itself. No worries, it's just a basic base coat, so it's not like you'll be missing any critical information, but rather than subjecting you to a long duration of watching both something getting painted as well as not being able to see it painted, I'll show you clips that worked and just get you through this segment with a joke. Alright, here it is. Knock knock. After getting that yellow covered, I actually wanted to start getting a better idea of how the overall feel of the model was going to be, so I decided to start getting my scale colored graphene gray base coats down. I start my first coats on the crab smashing hammer, and I know that this is going to take quite a few coats. Actual fun fact, Parson here is wielding a relic hammer, which back in 2nd edition Malifaux there were only like 3 models who had one, and it did double positives on damage to anyone with the Tyrant keyword, which is pretty darn cool. But here in 3rd edition, we've eliminated that Tyrant keyword, so congratulations, we did it! We defeated Tyranny! Mark that as another reason to play Malifaux. I also started putting down an authoritative base coat of graphene gray on the pants. If you're worried about both the hammer and the pants looking the exact same way by having the same base coat, well firstly, it's not healthy for you to have such stress over something so minuscule like how I paint this model. But secondly, we're going to take this graphene gray on the pants in a much more limited range than that of the hammer, so even though that they very well may be using the same colors to an extent, the way we apply and choose not to apply colors can make it stand out all on its own. Also, don't forget to paint all his cooking utensils littered across his waistline. Parson doesn't know how to use any of these, but when was the last time you questioned someone with a tool belt on and if they knew how to use them? I sure don't. In this step, we're taking scale colors deep red, and we're going to add some shading to the skin with some red lining. The aim of this step is to introduce some depth to the skin by placing some solid lines of dark red to where we will likely want to have some shading. The way I approached this is by identifying each different shape that is present in the arms and torso, forming a perimeter to each shape that I want separated for emphasis. Think of it as looking for big hills in the arms and then placing lines where the valleys would be. Any basic 3-dimensional shape in your model can be separated by smaller shapes that make up the entire thing, similar to polygons in a 3D model in video games and hentai. Don't worry about everything going goofy because it will certainly be looking rough at this stage. We'll make up for it in the next step, but for now just focus on loosely sketching in where you see opportunities for contrast, but only in the areas where you know you'll have deep shadows. Further along, we'll give more nuance, so the goal isn't to shade everything, just to put outlines where you know things separate. If you think this is intimidating to the point where your knee-jerk reaction was something along the lines of, yeah, that's too advanced for me, or that's scary, then you're just being a silly willy, my friend. Loose rabid dogs are much scarier than this, so why be afraid of trying something new that won't give you hydrophobia? Another way of performing this step is to just make a heavy wash of this red and douse the skin, but I found that with this way that I paint, this makes me end up with a result that has more red in the final product than turquoise, so I just adjusted to my style for this. Maybe if you have some free time, you can paint 2 different models using both the lining technique on one and heavy wash on the other, and report your findings to your supervisor, who will just give you a confused look because you're supposed to be working on delivering your TPS reports. So for the head and face, I do the same redlining, but it's important to take note that faces tend to have a lot of different creases, hills, and valleys in a much smaller area. So with that in mind, there are a few areas where I'll put a big glob of red that I'll eventually reclaim with turquoise and contains several different small shapes and values, and in other creases I just leave it alone because we'll attack these subtle shading areas with a softer approach, as these areas won't necessarily be as dark as the others. If you're looking for guidance as to where you should focus, I'd suggest start filling in the eye sockets, the cheekbone area that goes down to the jaw, and the upper lip area for most faces, but honestly don't get too too caught up, as we'll have plenty of opportunities to add more later. Now here's where we'll do that turquoise reclaim I was talking about. We're going to go back into each shape and cover up any places that had the deep red going a bit too far, and we're going to focus on refining each individual shape to where you want it to be. I think this is called rendering in art, but I've also heard the term sculpting your lines, where we start to rein in some of the craziness that occurs when you're just sketching in that red color. Although for the most part we're trying to clean up the perimeter of each shape, at certain times I find it a bit easier to start by saturating the center and then slowly radiate my way to the edges to get a careful and more organic approach to each edge. Other times I may know exactly where I want the shape to end, and I just start right at that outline to ensure I don't go any further. With practice, you'll start to recognize what you like and how to get there. This is a good place to determine where you want to combine shapes for more subtle shading with glazing, such as zones that have a bunch of tiny shapes together in a small gathering. The end result is sort of a cool two-tone model, and I'd assume that this is a good approach if you are ever wanting to try to recreate that cel-shaded look that's kind of like Borderlands. Try to remember your key light source being from above. Places like the abdomen won't get as much light as the shoulders and the top of the head, informing us that we can likely leave a bit more red dominating these zones. I also like to keep big areas like the giant triceps, biceps, and forearm muscle with as much turquoise as I can, because I know that in the later steps we can progressively add glazes to get a super cool blend with our bigger spaces. The face in particular will garner more reclaiming of turquoise, as in areas like the cheek and mouth have a bunch of different little nuggets that want both a red line and some turquoise. This way of painting by expanding the perimeter of turquoise is much easier than trying to get a perfect tiny little red line in these small areas. Overall, our goal is to set ourselves up for success for the glazing steps. If you're ever in doubt, I'd say that it's better to have a lot more turquoise than red. We'll have opportunities to shade this down more if needed in any areas, so it's more important to have your foundation of turquoise everywhere to make sure these future glazes are easier to stretch across the field of the entire shape. And since I don't plan on shading down any darker than the red, we can think of limiting the shadow as much as possible. And to show that I love all of you, here's some toesy action. Try to contain your excitement if you're in public watching this, you animals. Now we're going to take the deep red and mix it in with some Lamian medium to make a glaze, and start applying some shading to the turquoise skin to meet up with the red lines. This is the stage where you're going to start seeing some cool stuff happening and open up the potential of what you could do to the skin. I take into consideration that the key light source is above his head when it comes to where the highlights are going to be placed, so I go to the furthest areas away from where I want those highlights to be so that I can create some depth that makes sense for each shape. Try to imagine where the light would have difficulty reaching in each separated shape and experiment with placement. Be sure to reference each new shading with areas you've already completed to get an idea of consistency in shading, as well as predict if you're needing to combine or break up any big areas. Some areas will be really tiny and close together so that you can just shade the whole thing. Other areas like his big old triceps can be layered with several glazes for a super smooth transition. Deltoids and shoulders on big burly bros can vary on how you want to break this up, and in Parson's case he has really defined ridges in his deltoid, so I decided to keep each little hill separate, while on other models it works better as a big single block. Take note of these two areas, as usually these two along with biceps are usually the biggest single blocks on arms that tend to have consistent shapes among ranges, and gives you opportunities to show off and draw the viewer's eyes. For further emphasis, please ensure to awkwardly stand behind the model recreating the pose while anyone's looking at Parson. I keep a spare sledgehammer on my car just to aid with this. Now you may notice on the bigger flat areas that I start to glaze close to the perimeter, but when I add additional layers I start to creep in that color just a tad bit. I found this is a useful technique to use for glazing, as every time you go over the previous layer you're darkening the shade, but the part that creeps in is a brand new layer over the turquoise, making a smoother blend. When I start to paint the head and contemplate the last time I watched The Fifth Element, I begin to place some general shading to the overall shape of the head. There's a raised little fin in the middle that, when considering the light source, can use a bit of subtle shading to lean into the fact that his head is at a slight angle. I also took note in the redlining stage that he has some very subtle wrinkles and crevices at the top of his head, so to emphasize this, I do some light glazing by making some striations where the small valleys are to set myself up for the highlighting step. And I make sure to do more of these brush strokes on his right side as it's a bit further from the light. Then I continue to add even more glazes to his right side of his face to deepen the shadows, and finally some extra shading to the left side to set up the highlights on his cheek and his jaw. Now we're finally going to go from goofy to good with our highlighting step, and for this we're going to use Vallejo's Foul Green. For an idea of how to highlight these arms, I put on some coconut oil and flex in front of a mirror for some real life reference. I ended up getting a bit too distracted with my well-defined muscles, so I don't suggest doing the same thing if you have pythons like me and Parson here. So instead I'll give you some less sexy points to keep in mind. Essentially, you're going to want to use the same methodology we practiced in the shading, where we tackled each shape individually, but instead of placing paint in the valleys, we're going to put on some snow on the mountaintops. Remember to keep in mind that your key light source is above his head, but don't go painting the top third of everything without thinking. Instead, try to find subtle little hilltops to highlight. I think a great example of what I do is, right here in his tricep, instead of just highlighting the top third of the shape as a whole, I pick a ridge line that's closest to the light source and leave the rest of it as turquoise. If every shape is highlighted identically, then you really start to get like a pattern on the skin rather than an organic image. In some of these areas it's fine, like the abdomen, as it has a bunch of similar tiny shapes all in the least amount of lighting. But for your big zones, you want to look for ways to make them stand out a bit. Most of his muscles are shaped a lot like how his big forearm bulges, which is simple enough, but even in the forearm I picked a place in the corner to differentiate it a bit. We're going to do some more blending, so don't be afraid to add more foul green than you think, because that'll only just give you more room for the glazes later. Now we're going to make some turquoise glaze and smooth out all the new highlights to fade into the previous coat. When we painted the Owl Warrior, we didn't use this step as there was a lot less surface area to work with, but with Parson here, his skin is one of the most prominent elements that define his character, and it's a much bigger surface area, so we're going to give this part some extra lovin'. You'll see the big difference it does in large zones like his sides and his triceps. In some places like his abdomen, I'll cover the entire area in a thin glaze to show that it gets less light and to slightly differ it from the top highlights. For some bigger areas like the forearm and back muscles, you may want to let a coat dry and come back to it to make sure it's behaving, but also this gives your blending the smoothness of eggs. Glazes can be such a headache sometimes, but when you see results like these, you start to believe it's worth it. I've found that with any good advanced technique, it comes to like 90% preparation work and 10% satisfying final steps where it all comes together. This is true in both painting and bake heists, but not like I'd know anything about the latter or how important your wheelman is. What I really love about the entirety of this process is that at this final step you can see the entire range from deep red to foul green, all placed in such a teeny area and consistently among all the different shapes. Years ago I wouldn't have even fathomed how to pull this sort of stuff off, and it makes me excited about what else I'm going to learn in the next few years. Maybe I'll finally be able to finish that painting that'll keep me young forever in the attic. So when we get to the head and face, we're going to do some hatching at the top to create a cool texture that flows with the ridges in the sculpt. We already sort of started with this process with the red glaze when we laid down some shading. Now we're just going to continuously build up on that foundation. Think of what we did with the big layers and shapes on the arms, but instead of say ovals and stuff, we're just using lines. Keep in mind what direction your brush strokes are going and try to be consistent with it through the entire zone. Now that I'm editing this, I wish I kept this in mind when I swapped over to the other side, but hey, subpar is baked in the name. After this, we're going to get into that mean mug of his and start highlighting different places where we want to emphasize. A lot of the times this means his upper cheekbones, his eyebrows, and the ridge of the nose, then his jawline and mouth. But Parson here has a lot of different features that aren't present in our typical model, like the emerging starfish lodged in his forehead. I just do my best to highlight these where it makes sense and just treat it like any other element on the model. The idea at this step is to give yourself some room for further glazes and to provide a foundation for these glazes to play around in. If you overshoot on your highlights, don't worry because you'll just be creating even more depth for the coming glazes. The other thing I noticed when I painted his face here is that because of the lean he has with his head, he has a unique lighting situation that I rarely get to see, where one side of his face can prominently be lit while the other half stays shaded, and it made me think of Rembrandt lighting, which is used in photography and stuff, which has a heavy light on half of the face with like a small triangle that reaches the opposite cheekbone. I thought it was a pretty cool effect, so I tried leaning into it when I painted these highlights. Now you have another term to use at the art gallery. You're going to be so well respected now that you know two terms to impress with. Combine them for the full panty dropping effect, something like, "He stippled the Rembrandt lighting to display man's angst against society." Don't forget to run! And just like how we did his guns, we're going to take some turquoise glaze and ease in those highlights to the lower layers. For the hatch marks, I focus mostly on the ends of the lines. Toward my last few brush strokes, I go further up the highlight just to give it a very light filter for the coming additions. I also place a small amount of glaze over his face highlights just to push the color down a micro step. For places like the face that have a ton of details in a small location, this glazing really helps bring out those details as we're just going over the same places with the same strokes, but the glaze helps add depth. And now for one last reclaim of foul green. Here we're basically going to imitate the same brush strokes as before for the top of the head, giving it one last set of highlights which looks great on top of the previously glazed layers. Try to leave some space to see those other layers too. And with this being the last highlight placed on the face, we'll want to take extra care in placement, choosing only parts that we really want to jump out. The arch of the eyebrows, the peaks of the trapped forehead starfish, the cheekbones, lip area, bridge of the nose, and the forehead are great spots to emphasize. I found that sometimes if you just dot these highlights on in some places rather than just edge highlight, you can create some really cool textures, which works especially well since we built the glazes up, but it wouldn't pull off quite as well if we didn't. I know that faces tend to be tricky for a lot of painter folk. I hope that watching how I paint faces and what areas I focus on can help you. Although we're not painting with traditional skin colors, the principle of placement is really what matters, and you can just swap out the appropriate colors for this formula. And finally, the last step I do is put some deep red wash into the eye sockets. I like to do this to darken the area to make the eye stand out more. And now we're moving on to the pants, where we're going to take some GW Nuln oil and apply a heavy wash to the entire thing, and I mean heavy. Like so heavy that if it were a band, it would be like the heaviest band. And I'm thinking Avril Lavigne heavy. Skater Boy, such a classic. Just like we did with the Owl Warrior, this wash is meant to take the whole thing down closer to black without going jet black, and also acts as a guide for us to know where we want to place highlights in group shapes. Remember what the wise painting janitor once told us: "Your brush is a mop, now get to class, you hooligan." Move your paint quickly but mindfully, as we have a ton of finished work we definitely do not want to ruin with an errant flick of the bristle. Moving too quickly causes air bubbles, and in rare cases, the resurfacing of suppressed memories of being part of the Weapon X program, but whenever this happens, I like to push it right back to those dark corners where I keep my panophobia and fear of left turns. So here we're taking the base coat color of graphene gray again, and we're going to do some large highlights. The goal of this step is to set us up for the next series of highlights. So with this in mind, I'm painting in a broad target area, aiming for the majority of the pants but leaving some of the washed areas dark. We're going to be highlighting a good portion of the upper thighs, so I try to give as much surface area for those highlights as I can. He's got a ton of folds and creases which give us plenty of room to pick the best spots to push forward. This type of wrinkled cloth is a fairly common sculpt on models in all ranges, so getting comfortable with painting this material will take you a long way. With our foundation set, we're going to take some scale color rainy gray, mix it into this graphene gray at about 50-50, and continue to build on those highlights, focusing on the thighs. Essentially, we're bringing up the brightness to areas that should receive more light. I mixed the two colors together because I found it a bit too jarring to immediately go up to rainy gray on its own, and doing this in-between mix will certainly help minimize the amount of glazing a bit. At this stage is where I tend to separate some of the grouped folds that I painted together as a solid block of graphene gray. Doing this makes for a bit of variety in your shading, as you don't want every fold to only have that washed stuff as its shadow. Some folds are shallow and the dark area would only go down to graphene gray, and if you only rely on your washed zones for shadows, it'll start to look like zebra stripes. You can do the same thing by grouping a few of the highest folds together into a big block of this mix. And on to our final highlight of the pants, a no-nonsense, no-mix coat of straight rainy gray. I apply this paint in a very limited band across the thighs and stuff. I'm not being too precious about getting it exactly right because we'll have an opportunity for cleanup with our glazes. Just focus on the zones where you want to push the color forward. A little goes a long way here, as we don't want to lose the overall feel of the pants being a dark gray, and with more rainy gray added, you'll start to take this into a lighter color of gray pants. And I don't want to give him sweatpants because he's got to get back into the dating scene, and that wouldn't be a good look for him, even though it's comfortable. Now to bring it all together, I added Lamy and Medium to all three of my gray colors on the palette to make glazes, and I started to apply them to blend all the colors together like a Christmas miracle. Having a wet palette with all your glaze colors at the ready is super handy for steps like this, which lets you go back and forth between all your colors with the freedom our forefathers fought for. I'm sure they're proud. This is exactly what they had in mind. Alright, now we're going to start cooking our meat and potatoes by tackling the non-metallic metal. So we're going to take our rainy gray and start blocking in some zones where we want our highlights to go. Boy, we're really using a lot of gray here, aren't we? I know that this is going to take several coats before it's solid, so I actually use this as an opportunity to just sketch in where I think the highlights should be. This stage is for experimenting to see what you like best in terms of where the gradients will take place and how shiny you want the overall look of it. Just like when we painted the skin, we're going to go for sort of a two-tone look, deciding exactly where we want the brightest highlights to be as well as the darkest shading. This mid-toned gray should be the bulk of the color. I'd estimate between half or two-thirds of all the metal should be covered. The way I imagine it in my brain jar is that at either the middle or the end of each of these blocks is where the respective highlight or shadow is going to be. If the shape is cylindrical, my highlight is going to be placed in the middle of the band of paint, while on the more flat faces of the hammer, the highlight will go to the edge. Once I get an idea where the majority of my highlights are going to be placed, I make sure to go over each area with a few more coats to make them solid. The gauntlet was probably the trickiest place because it has so many varying curves everywhere with a little bump in the forearm, and I honestly didn't know how to tackle it at first. I break a few rules of lighting, but just remember folks, the rule of cool is the only rule that matters, other than the rule of law, I guess. Another thing to keep in mind is that a trait of non-metallic metal is the ability to have extreme ranges from dark to light in extremely small areas. Sure, there are some big fields that give you more room for blending, but what really trips you up is putting an entire range of black, gray, and white in something as small as the pommel of a sword handle. This means that you'll need to pull this trick off in both large and small areas, sometimes just skipping colors like your midtones and going straight to your brightest highlights, and relying on your blending skills to pull it off. Now don't forget to paint his battle chimes. They're important because it lets his enemies know that death is coming a mile away, like the neighborhood cat. Next, we're going to start slowly adding in that heated up chicken stock into our mushroom risotto and... Wait, what? I think this is the wrong script. Man, I need to fire my assistant. No, what we're really going to do is start throwing in some of our white inside the bands of paint that we just placed to get an idea of where we want our highest highlights to go. Try to treat this white like we did with the rainy gray, where we simply go inside each shape and take up about a third or so of each section of rainy gray to put our highlight. Luckily, we won't have to go searching for placements as we can just use our previous layer as a guide. Now feel free to mix in a bit of the rainy gray if you feel like it. It'll make your edge highlights pop more as well as help out with glazing. If you're ever in doubt about where to place this highlight, just go for the middle of the shape or where any bending occurs. If you don't like it, just paint over it with the gray, but I actually encourage you to stick it out with your first guesses and see it through to the end. When you're done with the model, you can look at it as a completed project and take notes over what you liked and didn't like. You'll be surprised that you'll find that what you thought wouldn't work at first ended up looking pretty incredible just because of the dedication you put to making it work. Too often I see painters stop themselves from new discoveries just because they quit working on something they perceived as ugly. You only showed one person, yourself, and what the heck do you know? Nothing, Jon Snow. Nothing. Give yourself an opportunity to make mistakes work. It'll arm you with the versatility of turning something bad into something great, like a mass communications degree. Now we're going to add some Lamy medium to all three of our colors on the palette and start glazing everywhere to smooth out the transitions between the colors of the hammer. One thing I don't think I've mentioned before is that when I do my glazes, I actually wipe off a good amount of paint onto my paper towel before applying. That way it's not loaded with paint, but there should still be some pigment and medium caught between the bristles of the brush. This also allows it to dry quicker, which helps build that pigment up easily. Now, just like with the skin, remember to have patience with this step. It'll take a lot of effort to get right when you first do it. Heck, I'm still learning how to improve this myself. I've experimented with making mixes between each color and applying them as glazes, but it felt like it came off a bit differently as a final result, so I've just stuck with the three colors here. But you should try it out for yourself and see what the difference is. You can also experiment with different brush sizes for your glazes. I've noticed that because I use a fairly small brush that the brush strokes become apparent on closer inspection, but it doesn't bother me so much because I like that textured look and it makes me think of brushed steel sometimes. Now when you're applying this glaze, try to think to yourself that it doesn't have to be perfect, it only has to be decent to work. Use some ninja math. 80% right when rounded up is 100% right. It didn't work on my teachers, but it works for your life. Don't let perfect get in the way of good, folks. Here's where I start my edge highlighting, where I take some white mixed in with a teensy amount of gray and apply it to all the hard edges of the metal. I use the side of the brush and drag it along the hard edges of the hammer, which makes it easier for uniform lines across the highlight. And every once in a while I'll use the tip of the brush to draw in the line if it makes more sense to do so. With the hammerhead, it was fairly easy to do, and with the hilt, I made sure to add some more emphasis to the little notches that separate out a few segments. After laying down these highlights, I go back in with pure white to emphasize stuff like the corners. Having the majority of these highlights done in near white, then finishing it off with these gleams of pure white can make these highlights even more interesting. And with the glaze work we did beneath it all, it comes together like a well-made casserole. I feel like this buildup of highlight did especially well in the rounded little rings of the handle, allowing us to have a good amount of subtle variance where all the notches are, but still within the range of the larger highlight going top to bottom over the whole thing. Now here comes the tedious part where we do some black lining. I take a thin down black and start carefully adding in lines between every crevice and gap between the hilt and stuff. Luckily this hammer doesn't have too many areas that need this, as I felt that the shading we've placed does a fairly decent job at separating all the key areas. Now this is the step that really sells the non-metallic metal by placing some definition and contrast to all the little nooks and crannies. I know that this can be tough. Try working on getting the right thinness of paint, using a wet palette, and rinse your brush often, ensuring to get a nice point to the tip of your brush. And be kind to yourself. If you're having a rough time, don't worry. With practice, you'll get better. And after posting the last video, I realized that maybe a new tip or two could help my wanting viewers, so here's one. Do practice strokes right above the location before actually applying the paint. This can help you predict your muscle movements by imitating the actual stroke you plan on using, and if you imagine it's the real stroke, you can get the right movement locked in. Then all you have to do is move closer to the model to finish it off. Other times you'll see me just straight putting it on with the confidence of a 6-foot GQ model, but that's just my spirit animal coming out. Another tip is to figure out your go-to brush stroke. In my case, it's from left to right, and all you're ever doing is that exact same brush stroke. For the horizontal lines, I'm doing my go-to stroke, and I'm just bringing the model home to do the job. If it's a vertical line, I can turn the model so I'm still doing my go-to stroke. For consistency, it's all about eliminating variables. Having the same repeated brushstroke and making the model conform to that stroke is one of those ways. And now we're just going to repeat the process for the pimp hand and the bangle. I actually really struggled with getting the highlights done right for this gauntlet. There was something about the way it bent on the outside parts of the shape that just really threw me for a loop. Plus, with the way that bump on the outside of the upper forearm was shaped, I was just at a loss at how to highlight and shape this thing. There was even a subtle little valley where the top of the wrist is that I wanted to make sure that was shaded correctly, and if I just left it flat, it would just really look less interesting. I even repainted the highlights and shading a couple times to see if I can get it right, but by the end of this part, I just resigned myself and figured it was good enough. Alright, moving on to the magic step. Now we're going to take some of that Lamian medium, add it to our turquoise, and start applying a subtle glaze to the metal parts where the transitions from dark to light occur. Now let me tell you, after the struggle with the gauntlet, I was so ready to do this step and get a little confidence boost to help with my waning excitement. This final step to me is pretty critical to taking what's already a fairly good looking metal to the territory of hot diggity damn metal. But before you start applying this glaze, be sure to wipe off a good amount to almost all the paint from your brush first. That way you get more control over the staining because this color can be deceptively strong. Try to focus on glazing the darkest area of the transition first, then slowly pull it toward the light, but avoid placing this over any of the highest highlights as you'll likely lose the effect. Pay extra attention to how you glaze the biggest fields like the sides of the hammer, as it'll be the part that draws the eye the most, and any over application will bring shame onto your entire lineage, and we just can't have that. I actually start glazing the outsides of the square edges a bit higher, giving the impression of a more rounded shape, but that way it's not so much of a uniform fade everywhere. This step is also good for applying a subtle shade to places that have very shallow valleys that you didn't place darker grays in. Remember to take note how the paint behaves with different directions of brush strokes. The more you know how to expect the paint to end up, the better and more predictable results you'll have. And remember to have fun with this step, but please glaze responsibly. You don't want to overdo it on this step as it'll be extremely difficult to fix if you do too much considering all the work we did with the gray glazes before. Plus, I had a step cousin who glazed irresponsibly. Emphasis on had. He was glazing and driving and ran off a cliff. Okay, so now we're going to do some small detailing with the eye sockets. I take a hot orange and start dotting in the sockets. I intend to mimic the orange glowy bits from the previous paint job, so I'm just roughly placing this paint where I think the light from his eyes will catch. If I were painting this like normal eyes, I'd have to be a lot more careful, but since I'm trying to make this glow, I don't have to be so precious about the placement. This will take a few coats, but since orange isn't a very opaque color, I do a fairly large perimeter. Now I'm going to take some pure white, place it where the eyeballs should be, and maybe catch some other areas like under the eyebrow for reflected light, and do my best to color the right spot. Afterward, I'm going to take the orange and paint over it again, acting like a glaze. I go back and forth with this until I'm happy. And do you want to know what the big secret is to painting eyes? Well, here it is. You sort of just guess you're going to get them done right. No one really knows what they're doing with them. Trust me, we all had a talk. And with glowy eyes, well, you just have to guess less. And that's really all there is to life, folks. Guess a little less. Plus, if you look at them at a specific angle, you won't be able to tell that I derped this eye job up like a bad elective surgeon. Oh well, on to the next lawsuit. Next, I quickly paint all the little straps on his back and stuff with some plain old black. And after that, I quickly highlight with a blue-gray color. I think it was Scale Colors Anthracite Gray. Followed up with a final highlight of some Space Wolf Gray. Not much to it, folks. What do you expect from me? Remember that guy earlier who said to stick with your mistakes to see what happens? Well, screw that guy. He seems like somebody who's perfectly fine with being mediocre and having low standards. Just shameful. After a restless night staring at the ceiling, imagining the room full of painters laughing at me with my gauntlet, I decided that I could take one last stab at making the pimp hand look even better. It actually came to me through a spirit vision from my great step-uncle, who's a Franciscan monk, that the reason why the glove bugged me was because my highlights were too thin, giving a more angular look, making the whole thing look like corners rather than smooth bends. So I go back over the highlights with progressive glazes of my rainy gray, and with great courage I start expanding the bands to give more room for the white highlights and decreasing the dark gray bands. I actually used the existing patterns as a guide for this expansion of the gray, and by glazing rather than starting from scratch with a new base coat, I can slowly increase its influence, observing exactly where I want my gradients to take place. And boy howdy, this is already so much better than it was before in my opinion, and my opinion's the only one that matters. I honestly don't paint over my work like this too often. I was actually being honest earlier when I said to work with your mistakes, and I generally hit close to the target of what I was planning to do, but every once in a while I get hit with a bug like this hand, but it's usually when I get an idea as to what I didn't like, coupled with figuring out exactly why I didn't like it and what I could do to improve it. If this were a regular minion in the crew, it probably wouldn't bug me as much and I'd move on, but this dude's my henchman and a fairly important cog in the crew machine, and he deserved better from me. Now let this be proof to you folksy viewers that it certainly pays off well to use thin paints. Not only does it help with a smooth finish to your model, but it also gives you room to cover up your mistakes, exactly like the workplace. My go-to cover-up is blaming the local biker gang for my tardiness. Works almost a single time every time. Alright, we're at the home stretch, folks. I want to thank you extra hard for sticking around listening to this long-winded painter talk at you the entire time while we finish the basing by placing some Naples red to shade parts of the rubble and slate of the base. Followed up by a quick and rough highlight of yellow ochre. I then add some shading using GW's Doom Bull Brown. Finishing it all up with a light dry brush of sand at the edges of the slate, aiming to show the textured detail and stand out from the darkest parts. Now he's ready for the final step where we add some dry pigments. Now here's where I start stabbing in my dry pigments to add some cool visual interest and transitions to the rubble. For the most part, this is done the same way as the Owl Warrior. The only difference is that besides adding in the reinforcement of the reddish color using the Doom Bull Brown, I just go straight into using that rusty red and the black because I'm no longer experimenting and I know exactly what I need to do, so no need to bust out like 5 other dry pigments I don't use. Once I'm happy with how it looks, we just gotta lock it in using the pigment fixer and some caterpillar action, later adding in a few patches of grass, and soon enough, this hammer bro is ready to do some pounding. And that's a finished Parson. Now he's ready for a pointless death from a terrible game decision, a time-honored tradition of my most important henchman. Thank you so much for sticking around. I hope you had a chuckle or two along the way, and maybe you accidentally learned something new by mistake, which would be entirely your fault. If you wanted more guidance on stuff like using dry pigments, more depth on approaching non-metallic metal, or maybe some other paint color tips like how I painted red, maybe take some time to watch my first video where we take on painting the Owl Warrior. And until next time, keep slinging paint, folks, and have fun doing it, or I'll show up outside your window and force you to have fun. What the? Lucy!